Welcome to the Mindful Healers Podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to our episode on what to do when parenting is a lot. A reminder that our podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Our intention for you today is to normalize that life, especially when parenting, can be a lot, overwhelming and overfull. Reminding you that you're not alone in this experience and that we hope to provide some practical tools that you can use right away.
We hope you will discover that mindfulness and self-compassion are where these practical tools can be found, and that mindfulness and self-compassion can offer you support during the very full, uncomfortable patches in life. And in fact, they can help you do more than survive. They can help you learn, grow, connect, love, and sometimes even thrive in the midst of chaos.
Our takeaways for you include that you are more than capable of encountering whatever is happening in your life, and that asking for help, resting, and connecting might help ease your way through the rough patches.
So the inspiration for this week's episode has come because for both of us, we've had weeks of a lot in the last week. And this topic began with a call a few days ago from Ni-Cheng to myself, looking for support and a listening ear. And then following that, I had a few more incoming distress calls the following day, reminding me and wanting to share that all of this is not a problem, it's life, and that distress calls are common in life. And perhaps that if we could shift our thoughts around them from being distress calls or a blip or a drama or stress and turn them into just life. This is just like what life is showing you at this moment. Can we live into these moments and lean into the stress and distress to create more connection and find solutions that work for us? And also to acknowledge that when we get distress calls or we're under stress, that we all go back into our old patterns. And I think I often judge myself for failing when I pop into my old patterns, and we'll talk about a number of old patterns today. But that we're not failing, they're just old patterns. And so of course we fall into them when we're under stress. And that each moment of stress is an opportunity to ground into what you know and to practice and learn new things. So I was reminded of this idea that's come up a few times, and I think we wanted to talk about it in the future, of post-traumatic growth. But thinking that in this moment, maybe it's like mid-traumatic growth, or in the moment, can we shift it to growing and learning rather than suffering and struggling?
I called you because I knew I needed a listening ear, and I knew I needed your reassurance. And looking back, that's great that I knew that that's what I needed in that particular moment. And thank goodness you picked up the phone. So basically, that day earlier, I had gotten a call from my 3.5-year-old preschool teacher about how disruptive she sometimes was being in class. And with her being in a Montessori program, how she didn't really feel like doing some of her lessons, let alone repeating some of her lessons. There was also some mention of the teacher like not being able to understand her verbally very well. And so with this news, I found myself in shame. I judged myself in that her behaviors were a direct reflection of my capability or lack of capability as a parent. And thinking back to all the hours of screen time that she had accrued over the last year and a half when we had been in survival mode during really the heyday lockdown time frames of the pandemic, that all of that had somehow wreaked havoc on her cognitive development. And now she had a speech impediment. And then on top of that, my now sixth grader is in the throes of puberty, navigating two volleyball teams, Chinese school, piano classes. And then to top it all off, I realized that I was failing at being a bunny grandma because Moon, our longer haired rabbit that we had adopted during the pandemic, would likely need some shaving of his fur because my eldest and I had neglected to brush him every single day. And so I realized that there was some really harsh judgment that was arising, and I was catastrophizing, frankly. All very classic, old, well worn, non mindful patterns of behavior. But in my recognizing and naming these as my habitual behaviors during times of stress or difficulty, I was then able to decide what I did next would be all the more constructive. So, when in actuality, you had reassured me, the facts are that my 3.5-year-old had been mostly home with her grandfather during the pandemic while I was on the front lines and my husband was dealing with some very challenging situations at work. She is being raised in a bilingual home, and as most grandparents do, completely normalizing the fact that many grandparents tend to spoil their grandchildren. Also, on top of that, because my eldest was in Zoom school or in person school, the youngest was basically being raised as an only child. So, of course, going back in person as a 3.5-year-old, there's a transition period. And of course, a teacher who is trying to understand a masked bilingual 3-year-old might have some difficulty in understanding her.
I just wanted to call out here the power of stories, right? The story that you originally had about how this had something to do with you and your parenting skills. And then this new story, same circumstances, 3.5-year-old home with grandpa, but a new story where there's so much that can already be explained here and has nothing to do with you, and how so often our stories are unintentional stories, habitual stories are about how we are not enough or judging ourselves or how we've made a mistake and how we should have done it better. And yet we can tell a different story that opens up possibility and an ability to see solutions. And one of the things you mentioned was shame. And I just wanted to call out some of the conversations we've had about shame and ideas that came up in Shauna Shapiro's book, The Good Morning, I Love You, and that when we're in shame, we don't see solutions and we're stuck. And so shifting stories to ones that don't make you feel shame can open up possibilities and solutions so you can move forward intentionally.
Grounding into facts can sometimes take the judgment out of the stories that we tell ourselves for alternative, more clarifying and true to life stories, as opposed to the ones that are tainted by our judgment.
The other thing that I think is key here is that you reached out to connect, because often we don't see our own stories. It's just common, it's human nature. We don't see them as stories, we see them as facts. And so when you talk to someone else, it's like, well, it could be this, or maybe it's this, that can really help your brain open up to possibilities as well. And so taking the risk to be vulnerable and reach out and connect can be a practical, self-compassionate tool to help you move forward.
In mindfulness based stress reduction class, there's a formula that we teach: pain times resistance equals suffering. And so basically, the one thing that can increase suffering that is sometimes in our control is that the more you resist the pain or the difficulty that's happening in life, the more one suffers. But with mindfulness, when you turn towards the difficulty with just how it is in that particular moment without judgment, because it's already present and already here affecting you, and you take some time to actually notice your experience of the difficulty, it actually gives the situation some space. It gives you some literal breathing room. And even just that, the noticing, the awareness of the difficulty, the acknowledgement of the difficulty, this provision of space can start changing one's experience and relationship to the pain or difficulty. And by doing this, we decrease the amount of resistance and therefore suffering decreases. And so once you give yourself permission to turn towards difficulty, pain, you can engender some self compassion. As defined by Kristen Neff, pioneer and co creator of mindful self compassion, turning towards and recognizing the difficulty is step number one. It's the mindfulness aspect of the component of self compassion. And then comes reminding ourselves of common humanity. There's a reminder that likely billions of adults are navigating the rocky transitions back into in person pandemic schooling while at the same time trying to take care of pandemic new fur baby pets. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, the question of how can I be kind to myself in this moment? And for me, it was my own acknowledgement that this was a difficult time period for me and that I could really use a listening ear, someone who had already helped and fostered thousands of children in their growing up process. My dear friend, and just so happens to be the podcast co-host, pediatrician, physician coach, Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And my job in this moment, though, was to be a friend and to listen, and really not to solve, but just throw out ideas and possibilities. So I was grateful that you called. Also acknowledging too, I think sometimes we hesitate to reach out for help, but when you reach out for help and allow someone to help you, it also feels good to them. And I want to share that idea that we think that we're being a burden, and yet sometimes we're being a gift to someone. And I was noticing as I listened to, as I check out some of our podcast download episodes, that our Getting Help Helps episode is one of our least listened to episodes. And I wonder if it's because we really do hesitate to get help. And even thinking about getting help is edgy for people. And it brings up a lot of insecurities about judgment. And so one thought I have in this moment is realizing that when we reach out for help, it can actually be a gift to someone else to provide help. And so not only is it good for you, it's good for others. And having helped you on Friday night actually was incredibly powerful for me on Saturday morning when I had all my own parenting was a lot moments. And my teenager reached out to me in distress early on Saturday morning before I was about to teach mindful yoga. And what's interesting is I thought about much of the conversation we had had and being compassionate and not judging myself and not judging the situation and remembering not to catastrophize was really helpful. And thinking about, how did I want to show up for this? And what could I do that would be of help was really powerful. And so remembering also that I was not alone. And so your reaching out for help reminded me that, I'm not alone. Children have issues all the time. And it's not that I don't know this, right? I help people with their issues with children all the time. But when it's your child, your brain immediately goes into panics, what ifs, worst case scenario. And we've talked about this before, because you love. And so when I can tap back into, it's because I love that I'm stressed and anxious. And I remember telling you that the night before, it's because you love that you're so worried, not that something terrible is happening, but because you love. And so I found having been through this on the other side, super helpful just the very next morning. And so for me, turning towards the difficulty with intention, as you mentioned, is a tool that's really, really helpful. And so I like to often say to myself, it should be different, but I can still make a difference, because I do find that my immediate response is to resist the reality. It shouldn't be this way. This shouldn't be happening. Why is this happening? What's wrong? And that when I can step into, well, it should be different, but what can I do to make a difference, feels very empowering. It's not so much empowering, but it gets me to this place of sort of grace and equanimity as I try to move forward, rather than coming at it from a place of danger or fear. And so when I tap into that, I really look at how I want to feel. And especially with teenager issues, how I usually want to feel is love, because it's for me, a more spacious approach. There was this quote I saw recently that love is a superpower. And I was like, yes, that's exactly it. And so if I want to show up with love, then I can just take this pause and try to respond and not react, and ask that favorite question, what would love do? And that leads you to, love would figure out what I can do to help and what's in my control. Love wouldn't panic and catastrophize and ruminate and feel stressed all day. It would help me to move forward. And love would also not disregard or bypass the feels, the sadness, the frustration, the worry, the stress. Love would also take breaks. And I think sometimes when things are going on that are out of your control. And what came up for me on Saturday was an issue with my teenager and social media and the internet, and something I'd never even heard of, and totally still don't exactly understand. But there's a lot of crazy stuff happening out there, and it is very much out of your control. And I was frustrated because my initial brain said, well, if he'd listened to my advice, none of this would have ever happened. But of course, he's a teenager, so he didn't listen to my advice. None of it should ever happen anyway, but you just get caught up in all the stories. And so allowing yourself to just breathe deeply and be kind to yourself and focus on this, what would love do? What's in my control? What can I do to help? Can be really powerful. So nourishing myself was actually one of the things that I'm really proud that I did that well that day. I, did yoga nonetheless. And I taught a yoga class about like breathing and taking good care of yourself, which was in part for all of you who attended, but also for me. I was like, wow, okay, well, I clearly came up with this theme, not knowing what was coming, but very much needing it. And so thinking about what feels good, a lot of like skin to skin and doing it for yourself. We often think someone else needs to make us feel better, but what can you do to feel better in the moment so you can show up as the best mom and parent that you can in these moments where all these things outside of you are happening? And so journaling is one that I think can be really helpful because it gets stuff out of your head. So when you're spinning, you can be more clear about, oh, what's the story? What's the reality? And then for a little lightheartedness, flowers are my thing. So if I'm having a bad day, I buy flowers, and the more the day is bad, I buy more flowers. And so for me, they're just healing and helpful. And so thinking about what that might be for you. And then the other thing that I saw recently is the power of tea. And I am actually very much a tea drinker. And so I love this idea that having tea can be soothing, but also having tea with someone else can be soothing. And so getting back to that connection. And sometimes the tea is literally the pause. It's the pause and being present with all the feels, having some tea, and then deciding how you're going to move forward. So if all else fails, flowers and tea.
So there's the literature about this, that when you are intentional about seeing or being in the presence of nature, even if it's flowers, and that you can help to bring about more of a relaxed state of being by simply seeing nature, being in nature. So that's what you're doing with flowers. And then with the tea, having a mindful cup of tea and pausing in this way allows the vagal tone to become activated.
I love that. And I think for those of you who are listening, Flowers may be your thing, or it might be a walk, or it might be music. Notice what's your thing and what is soothing to your nervous system. And is it tea? Is it a cup of coffee? Is it a chat with a friend? Thinking about what works for you and making that happen in the moment.
As always, we like to close our podcasts with some reflection questions for you. What if you simply acknowledged that life was difficult right now? Can you get curious about the direct experience of the difficulty? What emotions, body sensations, and thoughts are you having about the situation? Would it be helpful if you reached out, asked for help, connected in some way, be it with loved ones or getting professional help?
And if you want help showing up with presence for what we'll call the a lot of parenting, I would love it if you wanted to join me for Parent with Presence, which is going to be a 7-week mindful intensive that starts November 4th. Registration is open now, and the group is a small group, so the spots are intentionally limited to make sure that we are able to be there for one another. And it's a safe spot in which you can not be alone, but also find connection, support, and wisdom, as well as many of the practical tools we talked today and many more.
As always, if you enjoyed our podcast session today, please follow us, share our podcasts, and leave us some stars and reviews. We thank you so much for your ongoing support. Please join us after the sound of the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
Welcome to our mindful moment today. If it's safe for you to do so, I'm going to invite you to lay down. Lay down on the ground, on the bed, on a couch, on whatever supporting surface that you would like. And I'd like to share a quote by Kristen Neff, who we're very excited will be joining us for our podcast in the near future. She says that self-compassion is about being kind and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than rejecting and blaming ourselves or beating ourselves up. And so for this mindful moment offering, I invite you to give yourself some self-compassion by allowing yourself to be held. Allowing yourself to be held by the supporting surface that you have chosen to lay upon right now in this moment. Feeling the weight of your body against the supporting surface. Noticing the points of contact between your body and the supporting surface that you've chosen to lay upon. We often forget that we also sometimes need to be held. And you can access this by simply feeling into the grounding support of something that you lay on. Of the Earth's gravitational pull. This support that's there unconditionally for you, that you can sense into, that you can feel. Know that you are held. Unconditionally. And if it would be helpful for you, inviting you to do this with a child, a loved one, to hold them as you're also being held by the earth. Not because you are in the process of solving all of life's difficulties and problems, but simply because you're acknowledging that suffering is present, that pain is present, and that you can take some time to hold a loved one or to allow yourself to be held because there is a moment of difficulty. And as you're ready, you can feel free to continue in this position of being held, or start wiggling your toes and fingers and sitting more upright, checking in now with how you feel compared to just a few moments ago. Thanks so much for joining our Mindful Moment offering.